encounter with the church fathers, let's say, shifted your own worldview and how it kind of led you out of of the rationalist mind?
Yeah. I mean, now that's a big topic, but sure, let's
sure, why not?
Let's give it a whirl. So I think, for me, there were a couple of different things that was happening, and I don't know that I can talk about the way they were such an antidote to where I was at without talking about exactly where I was at. So when I dove into historical Christianity optimistically, like I said, I thought there's some significance to the person of Christ. I'm pretty sure that's true. So maybe delving into historical Christianity will be the right road to get to whatever it is that I'm looking for. But it was heavily disappointing. And I think one of the things as I dove into Western Christianity, I started finding certain patterns in the metaphysics that I found deeply disturbing. And those deeply disturbing patterns, they concerned anthropology, they concerned creation generally, and they concerned the doctrine of God. And so I'll try to go as quickly as I can through these things, knowing that it would take much longer to go at the depth I'd like to. But I'll start with sort of the anthropology of it, right? So obviously most folks are familiar with the doctrine of original sin and the entire idea that somehow we're guilty for Adam's sin and we're somehow crippled and incapable of doing things that are pleasing to God. And when I really looked at Augustine, what was notable to me there was that what you find is what's typically referred to as this nature-grace divide, the idea that nature can't of its own right ever, in itself be pleasing to God. And the context for this suddenly became clear to me as I was looking through and looking at the work of Augustine, because Augustine had essentially introduced this framework of merits and demerits and the sort of thing that became normative for the ways in which Catholics understand our relationship to God. And then that became, came to the fore at the center of the Reformation. So essentially Augustine was looking at the question of, scripture talks about righteousness or, justice. In the Vulgate, it's justitia, right? And so what is it talking about, right? That, this justice of God or attaining justice, what does that look like? And Augustine ended up developing this concept of the order of affections or the order of loves. And the idea is that whenever I engage in activity, there is a certain draw or a love, right, to a perceived good. But many goods are in conflict and we can't have them at the same time. So if I'm resting on the couch and I'm enjoying myself, I'm at ease, but then I think, I should get up and work out. I now have conflicting goods, right? I have the good of ease and comfort, but I have this other good of well, whatever it is, vanity, maybe, but let's say of health, right? And those can't be had simultaneously. And so when I make a choice, there's a certain hierarchy of affections that begins to emerge. And so the idea is that Augustine presumes that every choice we make has a hierarchy of loves. It's reflective of a certain priority of those loves. And he suggests that the just man, building on the Latin justitia, which means that you render to each its due, that the just man, his internal order of loves is reflective of the external order of goods in the world. So Augustine presumes that goods are not just subjective, they're objective, right? God is really superior to creatures, angels are superior to man, man's superior to animals, and so on and so forth down the chain. And so he suggests that the order of loves of the just man mirrors the order of goods in the cosmos. And so early on, when Augustine is dealing with this question, and he's like, okay, so what do I do if I look inside and I realize I have disordered loves? And early Augustine, pre-Pelagius, he says, well, you just will to fix it, right? You just change it, right? And then the Pelagian dispute comes along, and there's this entire dispute prompted, well, less so by Pelagius, but more so by his disciple Celestius. But nonetheless, the Pelagian dispute kicks off, and Augustine's facing this question, well, in what sense is salvation from God? Or in what sense is it from grace? If it's just me willing certain orders of loves, and those things are pleasing to God, what is God doing in this? And so this is where Augustine, dealing with the Pelagians, introduces this framework that really suggests, well, actually, my order of loves is, it's actually not in my control to make it just. What I need God to come in, and I need him to fix that order of love so that I can do deeds that are just and that are pleasing and meritorious before God. And this is where the sort of later development of the concept of original sin comes from, that there's not only an inheritance of Adam's guilt, but there's also an inherited disordered order of loves that I can't fix. Now, Augustine admits, like, sure, you can go ahead and you can choose to steal or not steal, murder or not murder. But insofar as it's coming from these disordered loves, it's never pleasing to God. This is a necessity of sin, right? It's always corrupt, it's always sinful, and so on. And so you need this sort of supernatural intervention where God flips those order of loves and suddenly gives you, internal affections from which you can do things that are pleasing to him. And then to make sure that Pelagius didn't have a leg to stand on, he suggests that even in Eden, before the fall, even though Adam could have done things that were pleasing to God, it was only because of this prior grace that, comes into that's there already from the outside, what he calls original righteousness. The other stuff post-fall is called, at least, by the time of Trent, called prevenient grace. But in Eden, it's, this original righteousness that's there, that's holding Adam's order of loves together. Well, the end result, what you get there is you get a couple of different things that start to emerge, right? The one thing that you get is this sense that nature really doesn't have the resources in itself to ever be good, right? Ever to be truly pleasing to God on its own. There's always this need for this sort of supernatural intervention that adds a little something to nature in order to hold up the capacity to do good. It's true pre-fall, it's true post-fall. And this is what's called the nature-grace divide, that nature is incomplete on its own. It's incapable of sort of rising up to the level it should to produce merits and, before God. And then that brings with it also an inevitable both anthropology and theology. So on the theology side, what you end up getting is you get Augustine insisting that that essentially somebody who is corrupt, let's say me, I'll pick myself so as to not pick on anybody, right? I come into the world and I have guilt from Adam. Well, I'm already not owed anything from God other than justice or punishment because I'm guilty for sins. But then also because I have these distorted thoughts, even if I try to do good things, I end up doing corrupt things that are sinful. And so again, I'm only owed punishment from God. And so what's needed is an act of mercy on God's part, but because I'm already owed punishment, God doesn't have to give mercy. And so this introduces a sense of arbitrariness on God's part, where he could show mercy, he could not, right? It's sort of up to him. We should be grateful if he does, not surprised if he doesn't, still praise him for his justice if he damns me, all that sort of stuff. And that's sort of the initiation of this type of voluntarism that happens in God, where it's all, in some sense, arbitrary, in the true sense of arbitrium, right? It's just God's choice, what he wants to do. And then also on the nature side and the anthropology side, it ends up creating this sense that, any optimistic notion of human nature is inherently flawed. And it's inherently flawed because if we really understand what I am, without this sort of supernatural underpinning, I can't do anything that would ever be pleasing to God. And so there's, that necessity of sin that's sitting there. And this is the sort of way of looking at God and at man and some of the doctrines that emerge that struck me as inherently problematic. I realize that many Christians are committed to, trying to defend God, and so they want to say, well, they'll go to the defense that says, well, sure, God is just, and we should be thankful that he saves anybody, right? And that's sort of the nice formal argument. But when we really look at this question, I think, the more honest folks who are like, well, so if I come into the world crippled, incapable of doing anything pleasing to God, and God decides to send me to hell and I'm going to burn forever, and I had no capacity in order to undo that, that just seems actually evil, right? It seems unfair, it seems unjust, it doesn't seem good. And also, I think there's, anybody who wants to look at human nature, and I say, I think there's something in there, right, that is good, even though we're all flawed and we have problems. The Augustinian anthropology is so pessimistic that it's really hard for folks like that, like me, who see something in humanity that's always redeemable, that strikes us as problematic. To read Augustine in the Confessions, like going on and on about, the pride of an infant that has the audacity to gnash its teeth and demand that it has its mother's breast, and just seems too cynical of an anthropology. And also in terms of the cosmos itself, I think myself, like the other nuns, it's very difficult to suggest that somehow there is this innate deficiency in nature, right? That you see in Augustine. Anyway, this is a much longer conversation, but the point is that what I started to see in God, in the picture of God, what I started to see in the picture of man, what I started to see in the picture of the cosmos, it just seemed untenable to me. It seemed to violate the intuitions that I had in terms of what I saw about, what I saw as the sort of redemptive root in human persons. It seemed to denigrate in some ways the goodness that I saw in creation. And the real problem with the theology of it was that everything that I embraced in terms of the most natural tether that I had to God was actually in the realm of conscience, right? And so the entire idea that somehow I look out into the world and I see these transcendent values like beauty, or I see moral values or things like that, those were the things that where I had come down philosophically was the idea that those are the intuitions that grab hold of something transcendent, a transcendent root that's not just there in the material facts, and which are my clearest through line to identifying who God is. And so if there are certain doctrines that are emerging that are obviously violating my moral intuitions, which things like original sin did, then this seems problematic as embracing this as somehow a true theology. Okay, so long prelude to reaching the Eastern Church Fathers. When I started reading the Eastern Church Fathers, I found that so much of what